Hi. Any announcements today? Anyone? No. Okay. Good morning. What we're going to do today is finish up on perfectionism and then move on to the mind-body. This semester for me has been going great, and there are very few things that I regret about not having done this semester. But the one thing that I will change next time when I teach the class, that I already know of now, is have the lecture on the mind-body earlier. Because I think it is such an important topic. It is so foundational, so basic, that when I realized that, and that was early on in the semester, that I should have had it earlier, I started already to plug for physical exercise, to talk about mindfulness, to introduce it a little bit on the lower level of the spiral. So today, a month or two too late perhaps, we are going to introduce the mind-body connection, physical health. But first, let me finish up on perfectionism. So remember last time we talked about the two models, the schema of the perfectionist, a straight line from point A to point B, versus the schema of the person committed to excellence, which is a much more meandering spiral kind of journey. And a couple of people yesterday in office hours asked the question, so what is really the difference? So you gave us the model of the rat racer, that person, remember, who at the age of 72 gets to being quite literally on top of the world, overlooking Central Park, and then being informed after a life of constant stress, constantly living in the future, in point B, not enjoying the present, the journey, is being told that it is time to retire. And I asked you a simple question: what kind of life do you want for yourself? So what is the alternative model? What is the positive model? Now, the positive model from the outside may look exactly the same. It may be a person who is extremely ambitious, a person who is extremely hardworking, a person who is an investment banker, or a doctor, or a lawyer, or a teacher, or working at a homeless shelter. It may look exactly the same from the outside. From the inside, it is radically different. How is it radically different? In that the person who's on the excellence side may be as ambitious, may have the same goals, may reach the same goals. However, that person also enjoys the journey. That is the difference. So yes, he or she gets into a top school, the school that they really wanted to get into. And at school they work extremely hard. However, they also learn and are able to mostly, there is no 100% here, but mostly enjoy their time in school, with the same ups and downs and vicissitudes natural. But enjoy school and then get into the job that they really wanted, or one of the jobs that they wanted, and work extremely hard there, and be ambitious, and work the 80-hour weeks. However, that person also overall enjoys the journey. And then they enjoy the next step, and being an associate, and being a partner, and being the MD, or whatever it is. The only difference is that they enjoy the journey. Now, I have a few role models that I know. One of them is my ex-roommate, who is an investment banker. We were in college together, also class of 96. After graduating, being an economics major, went to work for one of the premier hedge funds. After that, came back to Harvard, got his JD MBA, did extremely well here as a JD MBA, had all the offers that he wanted after, chose another hedge fund, and then went off on his own and started a firm with a few friends. Now, when I talk to him about investment banking, which I know very little about, I get very excited about investment banking, because his excitement is contagious. He looks forward to work every day, and he works long hours. So he's a model of a person committed to excellence. Even though from the outside, it may look the exact same as the caricature, quote unquote, that I depicted earlier. So it's not about losing our ambition. It's not about not being competitive. If that is what makes you happy. It is simply about learning to also enjoy the process. The step on the way to a destination that you deem valuable, that is important to you. Now, the question is, how do we overcome this perfectionism, this constant knot in our stomach? How do we overcome this living in the future, being afraid of the present because what if I fail? And I started to describe a few methods. The first one is being aware of it, being aware of what I want to change and what I want to maintain. Remember Ellen Langer's study about getting a more nuanced understanding of what it is that I want to change, because for a very long time I couldn't become less of a perfectionist, because associated with perfectionism was also success, and my subconscious was stopping me from letting go of perfectionism, because I thought that would also mean throwing out the baby with the bathwater, i.e. my success. But now that I have a more nuanced understanding of perfectionism, which is the incapacitating fear of failure, and I understand that I can still be as ambitious and not give up my success and yet enjoy the process, that's a better understanding, and now I can move forward. So the first step is awareness. After we have awareness, it's about going back to Dweck's notion of rewarding effort. Remember, Carol Dweck was able to change students' and adults' mindset with as little as a few hours. And sometimes these mindsets have been set in them from a very young age. The fixed versus the malleable mindset. And Carol Dweck, by teaching them the malleability, the neuroplasticity, how our brain constantly changes, by teaching them that to focus on the journey, on the effort, as opposed to the outcome, as opposed to the intelligence, was able to change their mindset. So in ourselves, we can focus on and reward our effort, our process, whether it's failure or success. Active acceptance. It will always be part of us. Now, one of the things that perfectionists very often do when they realize that they're perfectionists and that it's hurting them, they apply the perfectionist approach to overcoming perfectionism. Which means I will become a perfect person who's committed to excellence. That doesn't work. That's just more perfectionism. But what active acceptance is about is saying, okay, so I'm still a perfectionist. I will always probably have part of it in me, and that's okay. And that's okay. One of the things that the Buddhists talk about is that very often our greatest challenges, what Karen Horney would call our neuroses, whether it's perfectionism, the fear of failure, whether it's anger that comes up once in a while, anxiety, whatever it is that we have, that issue. The Buddhists cognitively reframe it and say we need to look at it as a tool for growth, as a way of learning about ourselves, digging deep inside ourselves, and growing. So to look at it, okay, so this is an opportunity for growth, for personal learning, for reflection, for more empathy toward other people, whatever it is. But look at it as a tool. Accept it, and then act. So one of the TFs, do you mind seeing what it is, please? Thanks, John. The next thing, after we accept it, we go ahead and change it. And we go ahead and change it by introducing behavior. The key issue here is behavior. Now, one of the things that I did, as I told you last time, was started to solicit feedback from people, started to solicit criticism, and initially literally had to catch myself from responding, from attacking back. Why? Because the criticism is a deviation from the straight and narrow, from that schema. But over time I got used to it. It actually helped me. And now I'm much more open to criticism. Still, sometimes catch myself when I want to respond and attack back, but overall, a lot better through behavior changing attitude. Something else, putting myself on the line more, whether it was the story that I told you about Brittany, who said no a few consecutive times, and that's okay, so she said no. I'm still here, I survived. Learn to fail or fail to learn. Next, we don't always have to act out in the world, we can also act in our internal simulator. The mind doesn't know the difference between the real thing and the imaginary thing. And therefore I can imagine myself, see myself, acting as a person committed to excellence. So for example, before teaching, one of the things that I visualize is seeing myself here on stage, feeling light, calm, and accepting. In other words, the way a person committed to excellence would, as opposed to a perfectionist who would be constantly afraid of failure. And the mind doesn't know the difference, and the mind looks for consistency, and therefore I'm able to be that way, or much more likely to be that way, because of the visualization. Also, meditation in and of itself helps, and we'll talk about meditation, probably get to it on Thursday. Because meditation puts us in a state of mind of calm, of acceptance, a state of being, as opposed to a state of doing. And when we're in a state of being, we're here and now, we're enjoying the process, as opposed to constantly thinking about the destination and what will happen if I don't get to that destination. But more on that on Thursday. This is a technique, a method that I learned from Samuel Coleridge, the British philosopher, late 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, one of the philosophers who influenced our own Ralph Waldo Emerson. And what Coleridge did, he had an issue with perfectionism. And perfectionism, as Winston Churchill later on said, means paralysis. And he experienced this paralysis when he came to writing. Writing was the most important thing in his life. But he really couldn't write well because he was so afraid of not writing the ultimate essay or the ultimate poem. So here is what he did. He said, well, at the end of my life, I will write my magnum opus. Until then, everything is a rough draft. And that liberated him because he wasn't worried anymore. Now, he never got to write his magnum opus. But in the meantime, he wrote dozens of beautiful poems, some of the most beautiful in the English language, and numerous very powerful, influential, and beautifully crafted essays. And they were all rough drafts, so there wasn't the pressure. This helped me a lot because what I did when I thought about this, I said, okay, so let's say one of the domains where perfectionism was very strong for me because it was an important domain was teaching. And then I said to myself, okay, and this was close to 10 years ago, I said, in 20 years, I'm going to have a leadership institute in which I'm going to be teaching amazing workshops and seminars and lectures. Until then, everything is a rough draft. Until then, everything is preparation. And that took off. Now, I know this is a mental game. I mean, I know that I'm quote-unquote fooling myself because in 12 years from now, when that goal is actually, when I'm there 20 years later, I'm going to set another goal for 20 years later to liberate me so that I can enjoy the here and now, so that I can enjoy the process, as opposed to being stuck on having it to be a perfect, flawless, everyday experience, which it can never be. So an end goal can often be liberating. The platinum rule. So the golden rule, do not do unto others what you would not have done unto yourself, or do unto others what you would do unto yourself. The foundation of most moral systems, most religions today. The platinum rule is taking the golden rule and switching it around. And what it says is, do not do unto yourself what you would not do unto others, or rather do unto yourself what you do unto others. Now, if a good friend of yours, someone you really care about, or a family member, fails and doesn't do well, what do you do with that person? Do you reject that person? Oh, you just got a B on this exam. Or, oh, you didn't win this competition. Is that how you treat them? Or do you embrace them? And do you love them any less for it? Of course not. And yet why do we apply these unrealistic and non-compassionate standards to ourselves? You know, the Dalai Lama, when he first was introduced to a lot of the Western culture, was baffled by one very particular thing, by our use of the word compassion. The word compassion in Tibetan is tsewe. In English, spelled T-S-E-W-E. The word in Tibetan means compassion for others as well as self. And he was really taken aback by the notion that in English, when we talk about, or in the West in general, not just in English, when we talk about compassion, we talk about compassion for others. And he said, how can you have compassion for others when you don't have compassion for yourself? The foundation is the self. The Platinum Rule is about having compassion for ourselves as well. Not treating ourselves differently than we would others. Having similar standards. Accepting failure in the same way that we accept it in others, in people we love. After all, why not? How do we help other people? Because very often people are in relationships with a perfectionist, or we know a friend of ours is a perfectionist. How do we help other people? The first thing that's important to make very clear is that it is extremely difficult to help other people deal with perfectionism. It mostly has to come from within. They have to want to change, because it takes time. It doesn't happen overnight. I know it from research, and more than that, I know it from personal experience. And yet we can help, after accepting that it is difficult. The first most important thing to do is by example. If I can change and become more of a person committed to excellence, enjoy the journey, celebrate, even failures, even falling down once in a while, then I'm leading by example. And remember that experiment, right? People do what you do rather than what you say. Second thing to do is to tell stories about it, which is what this lecture essentially, or the last two lectures, were about. Mostly personal stories of how I moved or am moving from being a perfectionist to being more committed to excellence. So telling stories, sharing. Again, the difference between sharing and telling. Sharing, both of us get. Telling is a one-way street. And finally, another way to help other people is remembering what Carol Dweck was all about. Rewarding effort, rewarding the journey. It is so easy to fall into the trap of rewarding outcome, and so easy to forget to reward the journey. I know that it's difficult in child rearing with my kids, and it's certainly difficult in a relationship. It's certainly difficult being the boss or a friend. But to really focus on rewarding the journey, on pointing out, oh, this was a great attempt, or this was so much fun doing it, the process. I want to end this lecture by introducing a mini summary of the course so far. This is a technique, quite a simple technique, but a technique that I found very powerful, because what it does is synthesize a lot of what we have discussed until now in the course. And this specific technique I apply to difficult situations. When I'm facing periods in my life, and it could be a long period or one day, that is very difficult for me. You know, when I experience anxiety or stress, or high levels of disappointment. And this is the alternative in many ways to the 3 M's. So remember the 3 M's: magnifying, minimizing, and making up, inventing. So the 3 P's are an alternative. The first P is the permission to be human. So if I experience a difficult experience, I go through a hard time, the first step is to give myself permission, and that would mean accepting of the emotion, accepting that it's difficult, accepting reality. Something just happened. There is nothing I can do about what has just happened. What can change is perhaps my interpretation of what has happened, which is where I get to the next level, the next step. And this is reframing, interpreting the situation as positive. And that would be the benefit finder. What's the silver lining here? What is the growth opportunity here? So if I'm going through a very difficult time, perhaps to look at it through the Buddhist perspective and say, well, this is a tool for growth. This will help me better understand myself as well as others, become a better psychologist, become a better business person, whatever it is. Seeing it, again, the silver lining, the opportunity in failure. And finally, one very important thing that we didn't talk about much, just in passing, is distraction, is looking toward other places. It's not always good. In fact, as we'll talk about next time, it's sometimes detrimental to stay and analyze every single emotion, feeling, thought that comes up. Ruminating in and of itself does not always help. Sometimes the best thing to do is when a negative thought comes up or a negative feeling comes up, is to distract ourselves from it by, for example, going to listen to a piece of music, going for a run, talking to someone either about that or something else. Now, this is very different from avoiding, because it's not about saying, all right, I'm not going to deal with any of the issues in my life. It's just saying that if there is a recurrent thought or feeling and I'm experiencing a Sisyphean battle against it, pushing the stone up and then being pushed down again, up and down again, sometimes it is better, more helpful to just say, okay, I'm not going to ruminate. It's pointless. This neural pathway in my mind has been so reinforced. It's not going anywhere. And then to say, let me move on. Let me listen to a nice piece of music. Let me go for a run. That will really help get my mind off this. And very often what the run can do is also help me look at it through a different lens. And we'll talk about it much more about this distraction because it's nuanced, meaning we're not about avoiding. So we'll talk about it next on Thursday when we talk about dealing with depression or dealing with anxiety using meditation, using mindfulness as a kind of distraction. But that's also one way of looking at the positive. And finally, the third P is about taking perspective. Is this really going to matter? This is Richard Carson's wonderful self-help book, Don't Sweat the Small Stuff, and it's all small stuff. Now, I don't necessarily agree with the second, it's not all small stuff, but certainly a lot of the things that we sweat about in our lives, small stuff. Now, the issue with not sweating the small stuff is asking a simple question: is this going to matter in a year? Or in the grand, in the large scheme of things, does it really matter? Is it worth my worrying and fretting and being depressed and upset and anxious about this now? Is this really going to matter in a year? And most of the time, it won't matter. The other side of this is that, well, then does anything matter? A few years ago, I was asked a very simple question by a friend, and he said, I know we haven't talked about it before, this was a close friend, but can you tell me what psychological maturity is? From your research, can you think about what psychological maturity is? And off the cuff, at that moment, and over time I revised that definition a little bit, I said the following. Psychological maturity is about the ability to willingly shift perspective. And I think it's more or less right. Again, looking at the research about this ability to shift perspective. Why? Or what is this ability to shift perspective? It's the ability when we want to be immersed in the here and now, in the present. And it's the ability to, when we want, take a step back, zoom out, both in time and in space, and ask the question, is this really going to matter? Or in a year? Or in the grand scheme of things, space, is this really important? And at the same time, go back, almost at will. Have this flexibility to go back and be immersed when listening to a beautiful piece of music or spending time with the people we love. And again, it's easier said than done, but over time we can train our mind through meditation, through cognitively reframing things. We can train our mind to be able to make that shift almost at will. So let me give you an example of the 3 Ps applied. So this happened to me at the beginning of the semester, about 2 weeks into the semester. I had to take Shirelle, my daughter, to daycare, and I was running late. I was running really late, and what I like to do before lectures is to work out, and I realized I'm not going to have time to work out. I'm hardly going to have any time to go over the lecture notes that I do twice in the morning before the lecture, and I got upset, and I became stressed. Then I said, okay, let's take the 3 Ps and apply them. First P, permission. Acceptance. I said to myself, okay, so you're stressed, so you're upset. It's okay to be upset. It's okay to be stressed, even if you do teach positive psychology. It's all right. The second thing that I said, respect for reality. This is the beginning of the semester. A lot of things are happening. We had just arrived from Israel a couple of weeks earlier. A little bit of jet lag, the kids. Respect for reality. It is what it is. And then I moved on to positive. Okay, so what's the benefit here? So the first benefit is, well, I need to think more about where I can simplify, what I can say no to, do less rather than more. So that was certainly a benefit there because it got me thinking about it. The second benefit that I thought about at that moment, oh, now I have another story to tell in class. An example of how I'm applying the 3 Ps. Distraction, very easy. I had the best distraction right next to me, Shirelle. And then perspective. Is this really going to matter a year from now that I didn't exercise before class and that I didn't go over lecture notes twice but only once before class? So I'm not going to give a class which is 95% great but just 90%. Is this really going to matter? No. But at the same time, I said to myself, I still want to be able to enjoy the here and now. So I took my time, spent time with Shirelle, stayed with her a few more extra minutes in daycare, we played together, and then went home much more relaxed, much calmer, having applied the 3 Ps to an actual situation that arose. Permission to be human, acceptance, focusing on the positive benefit finding, and finally, the ability to shift perspective. When do I want to zoom out and ask this, do I need to sweat over it now? And when do I want to be immersed in the here and now? Think about this technique. Again, very simple. Now, this technique is not equivalent to an inoculation, meaning it's not, okay, now you've learned the technique, I know about the 3 Ps, now for the rest of my life it's going to help me. That's not how it works. It works much more like a pill that you need to take on a regular basis. Meaning, if you're going through a difficult time, apply the 3 Ps. And the more you apply them, the faster it is. Now, very often, as I mention the term 3 Ps, already automatically I go through that process. Permission, positive perspective. It's much faster now because I've used it, because I've practiced it. So use it constantly. Try it a few times. Again, bringing together a lot of the ideas that we have discussed in the course. Okay. A year and a half ago, I had the privilege of spending a full day with Marty Seligman. He invited me to his home, and we were sitting down in his beautiful rose garden that he writes about often, and sitting and talking about positive psychology, its past, its present, and more than anything, its future. We're talking about education, about what he was doing in his classes, what I was doing in my classes. And then, halfway through the conversation, he suddenly stopped and said, "Tal, you know what the problem is with psychology today? Not just with positive psychology, with psychology today." And I said, "What?" immediately taking out my notebook. And he said, "The problem with psychology today is that our focus has mostly been neck up, whereas most of what happens to us is neck down. Our focus has been neck up, and most of what happens to us is neck down." Now, hearing this was very important for me. It was doubly important hearing it from Marty Seligman for various reasons. First of all, Marty Seligman has always been ahead of the game. He has, brought cognitive psychology when it was hardly known, when behaviorism was dominant. So his research was ahead of his time. He brought positive psychology, or integrated it, as a unified field of study. And Marty Seligman also, the second thing, beyond him being a visionary and a very important psychologist, he was also one of the founders of cognitive psychology. I mean, what is cognitive therapy about? It's about neck up. And for him to say, we have been focusing too much on neck up and we need to go neck down, that means he thought about it a lot. That means he really studied this phenomenon and really understands that we need a serious shift here. And he is very right. And this is the topic of the next two lectures. In fact, what I'm going to offer you is a wonder drug. And this is only for students in 1504. Okay, the auditors as well. You can have that wonder drug too. And here is what the wonder drug is going to be doing for you. The wonder drug is going to make you feel good, real good. Your self-esteem is going to increase significantly. You're going to be more confident about yourself, about who you are, about your place in the world, in social settings, on your own. You're just going to have higher levels of self-esteem. And we know self-esteem is associated with tons of good stuff, which we'll talk about 2 weeks from now. You're going to feel much calmer, much more centered. You're even going to get smarter taking that drug. It's remarkable. I mean, I know you're starting to get a little bit worried here. It's also going to make you more attractive. You're going to feel more attractive, and you're going to exude more attractiveness. Again, this drug has been tested time and again, and this is all research. This is not just whim. Here I'm selling you something real, something that actually works. And I should add that there are no negative side effects to this drug. On the contrary, there are tons of positive side effects that I didn't even mention here. More than that, you can rest assured it's legal. I know you were concerned here, but you can take it. You can take it, you can handle it. You don't need to worry about it. And if anyone comes to you and is concerned about how you've suddenly changed as a result of this drug, you can send them to me. And finally, I'm not going to charge you for it. I should charge you for it, but I'm not a good businessman, so I'm going to give it to you for free over the next 2 lessons. And here is the drug. In fact, it's not just a drug, it's a cocktail. It's a cocktail of drugs, because they seem to work best in many situations. So here is the cocktail. I hope you're listening now, because this is very important. The wonder drug. 30 minutes of physical exercise 4 times a week. The second component of the cocktail. At least 15 minutes of mindfulness exercise 6 or 7 times a week. The third component of this cocktail, with all these benefits: 8 hours of sleep, more or less, per 24 hours. And the final component of the cocktail, 12 hugs a day. The last one you can overdose on. Or rather, you can't you can have as much as you like, but at least 12 hugs a day. If you take this drug, you may hug, that's fine. This is 1504, come on. But no sleeping in class. If you take this drug, this cocktail, I guarantee many of the benefits, if not all of the benefits, and possibly many more benefits that I've just talked about before. You see, only today, we're beginning to understand the connection between mind and body. One of the first people to really understand it, who we'll talk about in the next 2 classes, is Jon Kabat-Zinn, in his wonderful book, Full Catastrophe Living, a phrase taken from Zorba the Greek. Jon Kabat-Zinn: perhaps the most fundamental development in behavioral medicine is the recognition that we can no longer think about health as being solely a characteristic of the body or the mind, because body and mind are interconnected. This is essentially a rejection of hundreds of years of Western thinking. Cartesian dualism, René Descartes: the mind and the body are 2 irreconcilable separate entities. And this permeated medicine. How do we fix a person? Like we fix a machine, we fix the body. The mind is something entirely separate from it. And again, Descartes didn't invent it. We can see seeds of Cartesian dualism in the works of Plato, which then Aristotle tried to negate, recreating the mind-body connection. But again, was made very clear, very evident in the West with Descartes in the 17th century. And comes along Jon Kabat-Zinn, comes along Herbert Benson, come along Alan Langer, comes along Tara Bennett Goldman. Psychologists, doctors who understand the connection. Comes along John Sarno, a medical doctor from NYU, New York University Medical School, and shows how with our thinking we can overcome most of our back problems or carpal tunnel syndrome, showing the connection between mind and body. Or the placebo effect, staggering effects. Remember, we talked about it with reversing the effect of ipecac, and asking how can we use the mind and the body to help each other to launch a virtuous cycle between the two, where mind helps body and body helps mind. I want to begin by talking about physical exercise, the first component of that cocktail, the first component of the wonder drug. What's happening today? Today, there is reduction of physical work. More and more people today have the quote-unquote luxury of not having to physically work hard. And I put it in quotes because it is one of the manifestations of the underprivilege of privilege. You see, in the past, we had to run after a deer for lunch or run away from a lion so that we don't become lunch. We had to gather berries for dessert. What do we do today? Go to the dessert table in our house or call up for pizza. In the past, we had to gather logs if we wanted to keep warm. Today, what do? This exercise. Turn up the thermometer. And we pay a price. But you know, when I was growing up in Israel, I remember, Israel is a Mediterranean country. 2 to 4 p.m. is siesta time. Very quiet. Kids are not out on the street. But at 4:00, sometimes even at 3:59. Every day there was a shout from the street calling Tao, soccer, and then calling the other kids soccer or hide and seek or running around. That's what we did from 4 p.m. after siesta time until night when we went to sleep and Mom called us to have dinner. What happens today in Israel, and not just in Israel, around the world at 4 p.m.? It's not going down and playing soccer and running around. It's continuing to be on the computer. It's continuing to watch television. And as a result of that, as a result of the fact that we have become so much more sedentary, we are paying a very high price. Of course, on the physical level, but even more than that, on the psychological level. It is no coincidence the levels of depression have gone up tenfold. It is no coincidence since the 1960s. It is no coincidence that the average age, the onset of depression today is just under 15, whereas in the 1960s the average onset of depression was around 30. It is because we have stopped exercising. We've stopped exerting effort, energy. It is no coincidence the levels of ADD and ADHD are skyrocketing. Not to mention, and I will mention later, the physical consequences of a sedentary life. You see, exercise is not a luxury, it's a need. And it's a need just like oxygen is a need, just like certain vitamins are a need, just like protein and carbohydrates are needs. We weren't born to sit in front of a computer all day long or to just talk all day long. Yeah, we were meant to do it at the end of the day after we have hunted and gathered. And whether it's by God or whether it's by evolution or both, we now have a need for physical exercise, and we frustrate a need, whether it's a need for vitamins, whether it's a need for protein or the need for exercise, we pay a price. Both physical price as well as psychological price. Seneca, over 2,000 years ago, the Greek philosopher, our forefathers lived every jot as well as we when they provided and dressed their own meat with their own hands, lodged upon the ground, and were not as yet come to the vanity of gold and gems. This is Seneca, a very thoughtful philosopher, talking about the lack of physical exercise that existed in his time. How much more is it today? When today we're living, in our age, the way that not even royalty lived just 100 or 200 years ago. The easy life, the luxurious life. And it's the underprivilege of privilege. We're paying the price for it. Let's see what our psychologist has to say about this. Ellen DeGeneres, on the state of affairs.
We're lazy. We have buttons doing everything for it. There's no physical activity attached to anything anymore. Even the garage door opener. We used to have to get out of the car and open up the garage door. Now there's a button you push, you know? And the car window. This became too much. I don't want to churn butter. I just want fresh air. We still use that gesture if we want somebody to roll their window down in traffic. We still use that, even though nobody's got it. Because we'd look like idiots if we did this. We're lazy. We used to have breath mints. Now we have breath strips. They just dissolve on our tongue for us. How lazy. Can we not suck anymore? Put it on. I'm tired.
Let me share with you a few studies about the effect of this kind of lifestyle. This was done by Michael Babiak and his colleagues at Duke Medical School. This was a very important study that launched after numerous studies that replicated this and showed how this applies, how exercise is important, not just for depression, also for other areas. So what Michael Babiak did was bring in 156 patients with major depression. These are people who have a number of symptoms, among which are insomnia, eating disorders, listlessness, lack of desire to act, depressed mood, many of them suicidal with attempts or thoughts about suicide, and on and on. These are people who are in very bad shape. And he brought them into the lab and randomly divided them into 3 groups. The first group was the exercise group. Second group was put on medication, and the third group was put on medication and exercise. The kind of medication was the antidepressant Zoloft, the second most popular common antidepressant after Prozac. Very powerful, works. A lot of studies compared to placebos showing that Zoloft works. An SSRI. The exercise that they were put on was 30 minutes of moderate difficulty, so aerobic physical exercise. So it could be jogging or brisk walking, it could be swimming. Not too hard, but moderate difficulty of exercise 3 times a week for 30 minutes. And then he followed these 3 groups, exercise group, the medication group, and the exercise and medication group, followed them for 4 months. And here are the results. What he wanted to see is how many of the 156 patients, or 52 per group, how many of them get over their major depression. And what he found was that in each one of the 3 groups, over 60% got better. By the end of the 4 months, they were not experiencing the symptoms associated with major depression anymore, or most of the symptoms at the very least. They were could no longer be categorized by the DSM-4 as having major depression. There was no significant difference among the groups except for one difference. The group that exercised only, it took them a little bit longer to get over their major depression. So with the medication, it usually took probably around between 1 week and 2 weeks, around 10 days to overcome their depression for the 60% who were helped. For the exercise-only group, it took closer to a month. But after the first month, once they got better, there was no difference. All 3 groups benefited as much. Now, very important point. This does not mean that we should do away with antidepressants or anti-anxiety pills or Ritalin for ADD, ADHD. Not at all. What it is saying, though, is that we need to perhaps first ask whether exercise is or lack thereof is the underlying reason for the experience. Now, why should not we do away if the results are very similar between exercise and medication? Why shouldn't we do away with medication? Here is why. You see, let's say, let me just draw a circle. No. Let's say this is the total population of people who are depressed. We know that Zoloft or antidepressant medication helps about 60% of them. And we know that exercise also helps 60%. However, it is not the same 60%. There is an overlap by definition because it's more than 50%, but it doesn't help the same people. So there are people who are only helped by medication, there are people who are only helped by exercise, and there are people who are helped by both. So it's not saying let's do away with medication. It is important. It helps. However, it also says let's Let's try exercise because I may be helped by exercise and not medication, or I may be helped by both. Here is the clincher, though, in this study. So what they were looking for, as they look in all these studies, is the relapse rates, meaning 6 months after the end of the study, when we no longer give medication, when we no longer push the participants to exercise 3 times a week at least. What happens after 6 months? And here is what they found. The relapse rates of the group on medication only. 38% out of the 60+% who got better returned back and had the major depression again. 38%, over a third. The group that did medication and exercise, relapse rate of 31%, just under a third of the 60+% who got better. Relapse rates of the exercise group only, and remember, they could continue to exercise or not. That was entirely up to them. The relapse rate of the exercise only group, 9%. Remarkable results. Similar results earlier than the year 2000, all the way back in 1984 for dysthymia. Dysthymia is usually longer lasting, but less acute form of depression. So it's a deep feeling of sadness. Lasts for much longer than major depression. But also exercise helps this. Now, when I first saw this study, and again, there are dozens, if not hundreds of studies by now replicating this phenomenon on different areas, as I'll talk about in a minute, I said, wow, this is amazing. So exercise is like taking an antidepressant. Seems like it. Exercise is like taking an antidepressant. But when I thought about further, I realized that that wasn't the case. It's not that exercising is like taking an antidepressant. It's rather that not exercising is like taking a depressant. This is more than just a semantic difference. This is more than just a semantic difference. Why? Because, you see, we weren't made to be sedentary. We weren't made to sit in front of the computer or in the classroom. We were made to run after that deer or run away from that lion. And when we frustrate a need, as we've talked about earlier, when we frustrate a need, we pay a price. So let's say our God-given or genes-given level of happiness, our base level of happiness is here. Our set point or set range is here. When we don't exercise, what we're doing is we're lowering that base level to here. If our normal level is here, what we're doing when we don't exercise, we're lowering it to here. And then, whereas we could have lived our life up here with the vicissitudes, and hopefully upward spiral, what we're doing is we're living our lives with the same ups and downs, only at a much lower level here. And we struggle just to get to our God-given or genes-given level of happiness. You know, I'm not a clinical psychologist. I'm not a therapist. However, if I were one, a prerequisite for me, for treating people, for working with people, would have been physical exercise. Or at the very least, being my number one priority of helping them to physically exercise. Because very often they would come because they don't have the motivation, perhaps, to exercise. But that would be my number one priority, either to make it a prerequisite for being treated or to make it the top priority. Why? Because I don't want to fight nature. I don't want to have to fight nature so that the person I'm working with gets to their God-given or genes-given level of well-being. I want to work with nature. Nature, to be commanded, must be obeyed. And one of the dictates of nature is that we need to be physically active. And I was just talking about this over dinner. I had dinner with Dave Fish, the tennis coach, and his wife, Bonnie Masland, who is a clinical therapist. And she told me, yeah, you know, she's been treating people for years. That's what I do. A prerequisite for treatment with me is physical exercise. So there are apparently psychologists who understand the importance of exercise. Why fight nature here when you can start when the base level can be here? Some other benefits, again, all based on research, and you read some of it in your readings, but more benefits to exercise. First, psychological benefits, self-esteem. On a few levels. First of all, bodily self-esteem. We feel better about ourselves. And also general self-esteem. We feel better about ourselves. State as well as trait self-esteem increases. In other words, as we feel right after we exercise, but also as we feel in the long term if we have a regular exercise regime. So both state as well as trait self-esteem is increased. Anxiety and stress. One of the things that are most susceptible to exercise. You know, Tommy can tell, my wife can tell if I haven't exercised for more than 48 hours. You know, I would come home and she would say, when did you last exercise? Why? Because she feels, you know, she has a sense of, you know, a little bit rougher around the edges, a little bit more tense. Again, as I mentioned in previous classes, I have an inclination for anxiety. And exercise, that's my drug. It's my wonder drug. At the very least, every other day. At the very least. It's been used very successfully for numerous clinical disorders, even schizophrenia, in conjunction with, not on its own, in conjunction with therapy and very often drugs. But it enhances the likelihood of success if you exercise as well. Also, ADD and ADHD. Not always enough, but very often enough. People who exercise and who exercise regularly, much more likely to get over ADD and ADHD. Why? Because there are numerous effects on our brain. Numerous effects on our brain. For example, the exact same chemicals that are released when we form new neural pathways, remember neurogenesis or neuroplasticity, the exact same chemicals that we need to form new neural pathways are created when we exercise. In other words, after we go for a run, this is the time when our brain is most susceptible to creating new neural pathways. So if you exercise in the morning, during the day, you retain much better the material that you have read or you have heard. You're much more creative after exercise than if you haven't exercised for a few days. And also, it helps us release these chemicals in the exact right amount. No more, no less than we need. Why? Because this is nature. Knows best what we need. And we release these exact right amounts of chemicals that we're at our best. This is, by the way, why, again, as I mentioned earlier, religiously, I run before every lecture. Well, I don't always run. I like running outside, but it's not always possible, so I jump on my trampoline at home. I have, you know, one of these small ones, and I jump on them, and I have my pulse meter on me. I shouldn't have told you this? No. Okay. And I can feel when I don't exercise before a lecture. You know, for example, when I travel and arrive right before a lecture and don't have time to work out. I can feel when I read my retention rates, my concentration levels. Because as I said earlier, I have a mild case of ADHD. And again, exercise is my drug. Physical benefits. Again, I'm not saying anything that is new to you here, but here is the way to think about it. We all have a genes, God-given level of weight, of the right weight for us. Now, when we exercise, we're there, and that is healthy. That is where we should be. When we don't exercise, we're going above this weight, just like we go below our base level of well-being. In other words, what exercise does is simply bring us back to where we're supposed to be all along, which explains why most diets fail if not associated with physical exercise as well. Because our body will always fight to go back to the base level, to where we're supposed to be. And if we don't exercise, we'll struggle even harder. Chronic disease, whether it's diabetes, whether it's heart disease, whether it's cancer. Once again, numbers are staggering, absolutely staggering. Diabetes, certain types of diabetes were only experienced by people 45 years and older. Today, kids in elementary school are getting these kinds of diabetes, and the association is mostly because of nutrition and lack of exercise. People who exercise are much less prone to these chronic diseases, reducing significantly the likelihood of diabetes, reducing by 50% or more the likelihood of heart failure and the likelihood of certain kinds of cancer. By over 50% reducing their likelihood. Again, a wonder drug. People who exercise regularly have a stronger immune system. Well, I have to prep you for this. And finally, if you haven't been convinced until now, hopefully this will convince you. Both men and women strengthens libido, their sexual desire. Enhances the likelihood of orgasms. People who exercise more regularly have more and better sex. And again, a lot of research showing this, and this, by the way, applies to all ages. To all ages. Well, not all ages. I hope. Yeah. 21 and on. No. Now, the important thing to remember about exercise, it is not a panacea. It's not a fix-all. Remember, not everyone benefits from exercise. There are some people for whom medication is absolutely the right thing, and it's important. However, in many situations, and it's evident by the literature, by the research, in most situations, exercise can help, even if it's not on its own. Even in conjunction with something else, it helps. And again, why fight nature? Why fight it? Nature, to be commanded, must be obeyed. What's very important is recovery. Let me read you something that Dinsburg and Zillig write about in the Handbook of Positive Psychology, two researchers in the field. Repeated workouts that are too intense to allow complete recovery may cause endurance athletes to experience staleness, a syndrome that is characterized by increased psychological symptoms of anxiety with increased sympathetic nervous system, catecholamine, and cortisol base levels. Now, what they're saying here is that there can be too much of a good thing. And this is especially important for perfectionists to understand. It doesn't mean that more is always better when it comes to exercise. There is too much. And some of the symptoms of overtraining are very similar to the symptoms of undertraining. Higher levels of anxiety, higher levels of staleness, lack of motivation, as well as ultimately could lead to depression. I mean, this is a symptom of perfectionism. This is something that I experienced when I was an athlete. Overtraining, not recovering enough, and paying the price. Physically, of course, with injuries, but also psychologically. What I recommend is between 1 to 4 days of rest a week. Ideally, you want to exercise 5 or 6 times a week. At minimum, I would say every other day. So it would be either 3 or 4 days a week. At minimum, every other day. Ideally, you may want a little bit more than that. Each time, about 30 minutes, could go all the way up to an hour. The key here is to listen to your body. If your body is hurting beyond the slight discomfort of exercise, which is natural, stop. If a muscle hurts, stop. Err on the side of too little rather than too much. Also, one of the ways to listen to your body, if you're not as sensitive to it, is putting on a heart rate monitor, which is something not very expensive, very useful, very helpful. So I know that my exercise would be around 70% of maximum heart rate. 70% of maximum heart rate for me is about 120, 128. So I exercise at around, between 120 and 135. And then once in a while, I also introduce interval training, where I go all the way up to 9%, which is about 165 heart rate for me. But very easy to find out about, what your heart rate is. Usually, maximum heart rate is around 220 minus your age. So if you're 20, your maximum is 200. Mine being 37, it's 183. Again, more or less. And then you want to be at around 70% of it. 65% to 75% of it for moderate effective benefit of exercise. And to keep in mind that quantity does affect quality. And once again, we have the graph that we see so often, the curvilinear relationship. So if on this side of the graph we had psychological plus physiological benefits, and here we have effort or amount of work, the graph looks like this. Where too little effort is not good, we're compromising on our base level of happiness. Too much effort is also not good. That's when we experience the staleness or the anxiety. And what we want to get to is more or less around our optimum level. And also optimum level given how much time we have. Yeah, in an ideal world, I would work out 6 times a week for 1 hour each time. In an ideal world. But I want to do many other things. So I exercise at least 4 times a week, 30 minutes each time. It's good enough for me. Identify what's good enough for you. Recovery is important. We talked about recovery on the psychological level. Recovery is very important in sports. Let me share with you just a quick story about Derek Clayton. Derek Clayton was a runner in the early 60s, one of the best long-distance runners in the world. One of the best, not the best. He ran marathons. And the reason why he wasn't the best, many people said, well, because physically he wasn't that fit or suitable for marathons. He was 6 feet 2 inches tall, 1 meter 88. His VO2 max, his maximum oxygen capacity was not that high as the top runners in the world. But what he had going for him was that he was the hardest worker on the circuit. He would run in excess of 100 miles a week. Way over 100 miles a week. Worked very hard. Sorry, I wrote it down. Yeah, way over 100 miles each week. And he became one of the best runners in the world, but never got to being at the very best. And then what happened? Because of his hard work, overexertion, he got injured quite seriously and couldn't run for a whole month as he was training for one of the most important marathons. And this marathon was in Japan. So for a whole month, couldn't train, hardly walked. About a week before he started just very lightly jogging. And he said he'll run in Japan. He was invited there as one of the best runners in the world. He said he'll use it as a training run, as part of his training regime for the next marathon. So he comes to this marathon having not trained for over a month, breaks his personal best record by 8 minutes, and becomes the first person in history to run a marathon in under 2 hours and 10 minutes. Running it in 2 hours, 9 minutes, and 36 seconds. 1967. Continues to train hard. 2 years later, overtrains again, gets injured again. And once again, for over a month, he can't run at all. and then enters the Belgian marathon. Breaks his own personal best, breaks the world record, 2 minutes, 2 hours, 8 minutes, and 33 seconds, a world record or world best that holds for 12 years. This is when trainers and athletes began to understand the importance of tapering, the importance of taking time off, the importance of recovery. There can be too much of a good thing. Very similar story. Joanne Benoit ended up winning the 1984 Los Angeles Marathon after having been injured and was forced to take time off. The Danish soccer team, another example, I think it was 1991, ended up winning the European Championship after being out of the competition and being brought in the last minute because Yugoslavia was just breaking apart at the time. So they came in as a replacement for Yugoslavia, literally taking the Danish team after it was eliminated from the prelims, bringing them from the beach to play in the tournament. But they had recovered, they were fresh, they were ready to go. Recovery is important in sports, it's important on the psychological level. Okay, so exercise is good. It's the wonder drug, the first part of the cocktail. I would argue, well, one of the most important ones. And yet, most people, not at Harvard necessarily, but most people around the world don't exercise. What are some of the barriers that we need to overcome in order to introduce exercise regularly into our lives? First, it is painful. It's not comfortable to exercise at, say, 70% of our maximum heart rate. Doesn't hurt that much, but it's more comfortable to sit in front of the television or play Nintendo. So what do we do? The first thing that we can do is divide and conquer. One of the things that especially perfectionists do is say, okay, so I'm going to start exercising. And to be fit, I need to do 6 miles a day, and that's what I'm going to start running, 6 miles a day. And of course, what happens very quickly? The next day, you get up and you're hurt, but you're a perfectionist, you're tough, no pain, no gain, and you go out for a run again. And what happens? You hurt even more the next day, but you push through the pain. And after a few weeks, you get injured. But even if you don't get injured, the schema that is created in your mind about exercise is the following. It is exercise equals pain. Now, our mind does not like pain, and it tries to avoid pain. So let's say you go on a holiday and you stop your exercise regime. You stop your exercise regime for a week or 2 weeks, and then you come back. It becomes exceedingly difficult to go back to exercising. Why? Because your subconscious mind says, I don't want to experience this again. And then it prevents you, it paralyzes you. This is very often the procrastination that comes through because we don't want to experience that pain. A much healthier approach is to say, okay, so I'll start with walking for a mile, for 10 minutes or 20 minutes walk. Do it for a week or 2 weeks and then build it up gradually. And again, err on the side of doing too little rather than too much. Because then, exercise, if I've built it up gradually, is not about pain. Over time, it even becomes sort of addictive in the positive sense of the word, that we want to do it, that we long for it. So doing it gradually. Also, use distractors. When I jump on my trampoline, when I run outside, I have no problem. But when I jump on my trampoline, I have to have distractors. It is so boring for me. Again, some people can be on the bike for an hour, and they're fine. For them, it's meditation, and that's great. But many people need distractors, whether it's music, whether it's TV, whether it's my kids running around, but having something that keeps us going. Social support. The number one predictor of exercise success for the long term is, do I do it with other people? Do I have the social support to do it? And once again, this is not right for everyone. There are certain people for whom the right thing is to do it by themselves. This is the time, especially introverts, where they enjoy just being on their own. Just closing their eyes, listening to their music or listening to their heart rate or whatever it is, heart beating, but they want time by themselves, and that's fine. But for most people, social support helps. Here is a study. This is done by Wing and Jerry, two psychologists. What they did was introduce individuals to a 4-month program that included behavioral change, that included diet change, and that included exercise change for 4 months. The two conditions were either with social support, doing it with your friend and a family member, or without social support. Those without social support, who did it by themselves, 76% completed the 4-month program, and 24% were still doing it 6 months later. So 76% did it during the 4 months, 24% only, less than a quarter, did it 6 months later. Kept up with the behavioral, exercise, as well as diet change. The group that had the social support, 95% completed the 4 months, 95 as opposed to the 76%, and 67% continued with the regime once the study was over for 6 months later. So it enhanced the likelihood of success a great deal. Let me show you one last example of social support. Okay, so this is not exactly what I mean, but social support helps. So if you haven't started, start today. I'll see you on Thursday.